Last summer, the federal court in Rutland decided that this case could proceed as a class action and certified the property class as well as a subclass of people who drank contaminated water and have elevated levels of PFOA in their blood as members of the exposure class.
Class action really is designed to help the little person when they're up against big corporations. It's certainly a lot better for the average person to have the benefit of being a member of a class, because if they were up against a big corporation by themselves, very few people would be able to afford to do it. So our law firms, we pay our expenses out, we take the risk. And if we don't win, that's the risk that we took.
So the class of property owners can determine if they're members by their address. Anyone who owns property within the state-defined zone of contamination is a property class member. And to double check, they can email us through the website, benningtonclassaction.com, and we will be able to walk them through the process of determining if their properties are within the property class.
We're talking about 2,300 properties and 8,000 people who have been consuming this water that's been poisoned.
The measure of damages when an industrial neighbor contaminates your property is how much your property has lost in value because of the chemical contamination. In addition, Vermont law has long allowed people also to recover damages for their inability to use and enjoy their properties in all the ways that they could have when their property was not contaminated. Vermont allows property owners to testify as experts regarding the value and diminished value of their property. And each of our representative plaintiffs have testified to range from around 30%, maybe 35% of damages to about 20%. We also have retained the services of a real estate appraiser. So all of those factors go into our helping property owners understand and be able to testify to what their individual property losses are. So I've done a lot of environmental cases in my career, starting from the mid-1980s. And we've taken on such corporate giants as International Paper Company, General Electric. In this case, because quite a number of Bennington and North Bennington residents who had contaminated wells now have elevated levels of this chemical in their blood. In addition to the property damages, anyone who's a member of the exposure class will be eligible for a remedy called medical monitoring that we are seeking in this case, where they'll have their blood tested, they'll be able to talk to an environmental medicine specialist, which will increase the likelihood that they'll have much better medical outcomes. The way the PFOA contamination occurred in this case was through air pollution. So the PFOA was emitted out of the smokestacks. It then precipitates down onto the soils everywhere in the zone of contamination. Some of it remains in the soils, depending on the nature of the soils, and some of it, most of it, precipitates down through the soils into the groundwater and then into the deep bedrock aquifers. It's going to be decades before the natural process of the groundwater moving through the aquifer before the levels of contamination start to dissipate. And as a result of that, the state of Vermont is in the process of reclassifying the groundwater under the entire zone of contamination as class 4 non-potable. Under federal law, we currently leave it up to chemical manufacturers or chemical producers to report to the EPA whether they are producing and selling a chemical that's unsafe. PFOA started to be manufactured, and by the 40s, 50s, 60s, the companies that were manufacturing it had been conducting internal lab studies on the chemical and on their own workers exposed to the chemical, and found through these studies that the chemical was extremely toxic and caused birth defects and caused cancers and caused illnesses. But they kept that information from the EPA. And it wasn't until a private lawsuit like this one that those documents were eventually sent to the EPA. And so it's private lawsuits like this that work hand in hand with regulatory enforcement to try to say to companies like Saint-Gobain, it's not okay that for decades you allowed this chemical to spew out while you retained all the profits, and your neighbors achieved none of those profits, but all of the harms and losses that result from that.
When you hold a corporation like Saint-Gobain accountable and force them to take responsibility for their actions, that sends a strong message to all businesses that they need to be really careful before they start spewing chemicals out into the atmosphere. There's good that there will be consequences down the road, and they have to assume responsibility for it. We reasonably expected that we would either settle the case or try the case last year, but because of the pandemic, that didn't happen. If things work out the way we hope, I think we can reasonably expect to either settle or try this case by the end of this year.